Amen. You may be seated. Today we finish up 1 Corinthians. We'll be in chapter 16 as a reminder. 1 Corinthians is the Apostle Paul. He's writing to the Christians at Corinth. This is the end of his letters. Matter of fact, if we look at the end of the chapter 16, as he kind of sends off, he says, listen, I'm writing this with my own hand. And so they understood this was coming from the Apostle Paul, inspired by the Holy Spirit. So the church at Corinth, the elders and leaders there would have gotten this inspired letter. They knew Paul had the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, and they would have read it, and they would have used it to continue to grow. They would have used it to continue to understand how they were to live as Christ followers. What is the message of the gospel? This was something they really, really needed, and Paul was speaking to them. As we end chapter 1 Corinthians today, I'm also going to kind of branch into 2 Corinthians. So Paul writes 1 Corinthians. He also writes 2 Corinthians, and I'm going to branch into that because the last part of 1 Corinthians chapter 16, Paul's hitting different aspects of things he wants them to know, of what there is happening. But then also in 2 Corinthians, he picks up on some of the same topics that they probably weren't getting well enough. He picks up on some things that he's going to have to reiterate again, and that'll be the topic for today. Now again, I have to warn you, this message was developed by me thinking I was going to have a screen behind me, and so you'd be able to follow along with the words. And when there was a specific word, you know how we underline it, and then I give you this means that or whatever. So I already talked to people first service, and they said, man, we really had to pay attention, so I want you to pay attention because I'm going to read to you the last part of the letter to 1 Corinthians, and then I'm going to go into 2 Corinthians because really the thought and the theme, the idea is carried over there, and he reiterates it. I'm going to read a lot of it. Why am I doing that? Because many times we just kind of pick out verses and we don't understand that Paul is writing a letter. There's a long thought. So I'm going to read a lot of passages, which would be a lot easier if you could see it behind me. And also because today's message, as we're looking at, is the 5 G's of giving. And really in this message, we're going to learn from Paul as he's just telling the story, as he's talking to them. He's going to give them the principles of how does the local church function when it comes to giving. He's going to give them really the principles of how they are to give as Christians. He does this in the context of telling them what's going on. And so I'm going to read it. And if we had the screen behind me, every time there was a G word that we're using, it would be highlighted. So I'm just going to put my hand up to draw attention to it. So you're going to have to really, really focus, right, on what we're saying, because again, it's not going to be behind me. We're going old school. You got to really pay attention. 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 1 through 3. Paul says, now about the collection for the saints, the collection for the Christians. Do the same as I instructed the Galatian church. Now again, just as a point of reference, Paul's talking to the Christians at the church in Corinth. And then he says to them, as it goes to the collection for the church, I want you to do the same thing that I already told the Galatian church. You can go read that in the book of Galatians. As a reminder, when Paul is writing, the word church, ecclesia, is used a little over 100 times in the New Testament, and about 93 times it's talking about a specific church. And so he's talking to the Christians at Corinth. He's using the example of, hey, like I already told the churches in Galatia, which we would call the book of Galatians, I want you to do the same thing. Verse 2, on the first day of the week, each of you is to set something aside and save in keeping with how he is prospering. First day of the week is Sunday. And you're going to set aside what you're going to give by how you're prospering so that no collections will need to be made when I come. Verse 3, when I arrive, I will send with letters those you recommend to carry your gift to Jerusalem. Paul says, listen to the church at Corinth. I want you to know you keep doing your regular collections. As a matter of fact, when I get there, we're going to use a part of your regular collections, as we're going to see here later, a surplus, And then you're going to pick some trustworthy people, and we're going to take from your budgeted money that you have, and we're going to take that, and these trustworthy people are going to carry that cash to Jerusalem, and they're going to help some of the poor folks there. As you see when I'm reading through this, the reason I'm going to read all of this and then jump to 2 Corinthians, because Paul's talking about the same thing. He's talking about how the church functions. He's talking about how each local church functions and has a budget and has ministry money and how they're to share with each other. But also, we're going to see that they're planting churches in Macedonia. They're helping the poor folks in Jerusalem. And really, as I read through this, what you're going to see is, how does the church economy, budgeting, how's the whole thing work? I get asked that all the time, especially those who are new Christians. They really didn't grow up in church. They don't understand. How does this whole thing function? This is a great story because Paul is kind of giving them this idea of how it's functioning. I'm going to come back to each aspect of what he says. So now I'm just going to read through. We're going to jump to 2 Corinthians. Again, in the book of 2 Corinthians, he's reiterating what he's already taught in 1 Corinthians, but they still are having some challenges. Also, he's going to up the ante of the principles that he's teaching. So we finished with 1 Corinthians chapter 16. In verse 3, he said this: "When I arrive, I will send with letters those recommend to carry your gift to Jerusalem." I want to pause again. For the rest of the verses I'm going to read, whenever I say the word, if the screen was here, you'd see gift. Whenever you see or say, I say the word gift in grace, you should know that in the original, it's the same word. It's the exact same word. When Paul says grace, it's the Greek word charis. When he used the word gift, it's the Greek word charis. It's the context that allows you to understand what exactly he's meaning. But he wants them to make sure that when they're talking about the gifts that they bring on a regular basis, that it's an act of grace. And when he talks about grace, it is the gift. And so if I asked you a question like, hey, define grace to me, you would say something like, well, it's the unmerited favor. It's God's free gift. And so Paul's going to go back and forth. I'll teach on it later. But as you're hearing grace and gift, you need to understand it's the same exact word. Context here is telling us, but in Paul's mind, this is why we call it grace giving. So 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 1 and following, he's now talking about the giving to the church in Macedonia and how the church at Corinth has been so helpful in this planting. He says to them in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, "We want you to know, brothers and sisters, about the grace of God that was given to the churches at Macedonia. During a severe trial brought about by affliction, their abundant joy and their extreme poverty overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. I can testify that according to their ability and even beyond their ability of their own accord, they begged us earnestly for the privilege of sharing in the ministry to the saints." So he's saying, hey, this church in Macedonia, they were struggling, but they knew the gospel ministry was important, and so they continued to give, and they begged to be able to partner. And so this word here, he's going to use it a couple times. They begged us earnestly for the privilege of sharing in the ministry. That word sharing is the Greek word koinonia. Many of us know koinonia is the word for fellowship. And so you're going to see him using the word sharing and fellowship interchangeably, just like grace and giving interchangeably, because he's setting the tone. He wants them to understand when you're doing life together, when you're in the local church together, you share life together, you do ministry together, and it absolutely comes down to the part of also sharing in resources. They begged us earnestly for the privilege of sharing in the ministry to the saints. And not just as we had hoped, instead they gave themselves first to the Lord and then to us by God's will. Verse 6, "So we urged Titus that just as he had begun, so he should complete among you this act of grace." Church at Corinth, you should be doing what Macedonia is doing. "Now as you excel in everything, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, and in all diligence, and in your love for us, excel also in this act of grace," this giving. I am not saying this as a command. Rather, by means of diligence of others, I am testing the genuineness of your love. I'm testing the genuineness of your love. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ. Though he was rich, for your sake he became poor, so that by his poverty you might become rich. And in this matter I am giving advice because it is profitable for you, who began last year not only to do something, but you also want to do it. Verse 11, now also finish the task, so that just as there was an eager desire on your part for missions and ministry, there may also be completion according to what you have. For the eagerness is there. The gift is acceptable according to what a person has, not according to what he does not have. It is not that there should be relief for others and hardship for you, but it is a question of equality. He's understanding again, fellowship, church. We're all in this together. We all have different resources, but we're all to be a part of it. Verse 14. At the present time, your surplus is available for their need, so that their abundance may be in turn meet your need, in order that there may be equality. Again, he's just laying out for us the principle while we just see what's happening. That when this church has this, they share with this church, and this folks, and these folks, and the church has resources for missions and ministry. He says in verse 15, as it is written, the person who had much did not have too much, and the person who had little did not have too little, because everybody was sharing. They understood the gospel giving. Verse 14, thanks be to God who put the same concern for you into the heart of Titus. For he welcomed our appeal, and being very diligent went out to you by his own choice. We have sent with him the brother who is praised among all churches for this gospel ministry. And not only that, but he was also appointed by the churches to accompany us with the gracious gift that we are administering for the glory of the Lord himself, and to show our eagerness to help. So he's just walking them through. Again, he's not giving specific principles. He's not telling them what they should be doing. He's telling them in the sense of a list. I'm going to help us do that. He's just telling them what's happening and what should be happening. As 2 Corinthians chapter 9 concludes, he then is going to kind of round it out. What does it mean, this grace giving? Verse 6 of chapter 9. The point is this, Paul says. The person who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly. And the person who sows generously will reap generously. Each person should do as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or out of compulsion, since God loves a cheerful giver. And God is able to make every grace overflow to you, so that in every way, always having everything you need, that's a promise, you may excel in every good work. As it is written, he distributed freely, he gave to the poor, his righteousness endures forever. Paul says everything you need will be given. Why? So that you can continue to work. What's the work? The ministry, the gospel ministry. Verse 10. Now the one who provides seed for the sower and bread for food will also provide and multiply your seed and increase the harvest for your righteousness. For your righteousness. You will be enriched in every way for all generosity, which produces thanksgiving to God through us. For the ministry of this service is not our only supplying the needs of the Christians here, the saints, but is also overflowing in many expressions of thanks to God. People are seeing what's happening there at the local church. Because of the proof provided by this ministry, they will glorify God for your obedient confession of the gospel of Christ and for your generosity in sharing. There's that word again, koinonia, your generosity in the fellowship with them and with everyone. And it's verse 14, as they pray on your behalf, they will have deep affection for you because of the surpassing grace of God in you. Thanks be to God for this indescribable gift. And so I have highlighted, hopefully, best I can, all the G words. And as Paul is telling them what is happening, as they are understanding how does the system work, we can then pull out of there what I'm calling the 5 G's of giving. The answers really to the top 5 questions I always get, we get as church leaders to this idea of giving. And as we read through an actual occurrence, Paul, in a conversational way of real churches doing real ministry and real people, both those they would consider those with poor, those who are wealthy, all coming together, we can then kind of pull out of there, answer some basic questions. I think it's very fitting that when Paul finishes his letter, the last chapter, the one last aspect that he really is talking about, he's just reminding them, how does ministry happen? How does this whole thing function? So the 5 G's of giving, as a reminder, you got to really listen. Because if you've been here before, you know I would list them all out. And as I say it, you could see it. Well, now you can't do that. So really dial in and make sure. The first G of giving is grace. And it answers the question, who should give? Paul says it in chapter 16 of 1 Corinthians. He said it in chapter 8 of 2 Corinthians. He says it in Galatians. He says it in Timothy. When he's talking about the giving, the collection for the local church, who should give? The word is grace. It's each person who has received God's grace, God's forgiveness of sins. Each person who claims the name of Christ as a Christian gives. And so the first thing we have to understand is grace. Now remember that word grace that he uses here. Our second word is going to be gift. It's the exact same word. I'm going to show you how it goes together. But just a simple, and we can move on. When you think about, should I give? Who gives? If you're a Christian and a part of a local church, then you are to give because of the grace that has been given to you, freely given. Second word is gift. This answers the question, how much should I give? And again, if you use the word grace and then gift, and then we have them as 2 different words, in the original letter here, Paul's right, it's the exact same word. Context allows you to understand, which is why the interpreters that do it here, they give us grace and gift. Paul's using the same word. He understood the context because he wants them to make sure that when you think of the grace that's been given you to salvation, then that is what inspires you to give a gift. Same exact word. The gift of salvation inspires me to give, as we're going to see, to the gospel ministry. And so those who have been given grace now give, and it's grace given. Freely I have received, and freely I will give, as Paul says. So how much should I give? I'm going to pause for a second and answer some basic questions, because many of us, if we grew up in church, maybe you've heard the word tithe. And you say, well, tithe, yeah, it means 10%. So what does the Bible teach? What does Team Church believe the Bible teaches about this concept of tithing? I'm going to give you 2 basic biblical ideas or teachings of tithe. The first one goes this way, thinking of the 10%. The first one would believe, and the biblical idea would be that the Old Testament absolutely shows and teaches that the Jewish nation, even before the Mosaic law, had a tithing. They were told to tithe. They lived not under a democracy, but a theocracy, meaning the Jewish nation believed, and it was, God oversaw them, and so there wasn't any government. So it was very clear that they set a system of taxing to fund government things, the nation of Israel. They had a sense of tithing that was also seen as a tax, 10%, to fund the temple and the community and the poor. As a matter of fact, an Old Testament Jewish person in the nation of Israel, before and then during the Mosaic law, all of the Old Testament, if they were following God and all the commands and all the rules, they probably gave back about 30%. And definitely 10 of that was to go to the temple to help with the poor and help with the feeding and the whole aspect. Now, there are people today who then teach and believe that because that was true of them, that even in the New Testament, that the tithe is what a Christian has to do, that is a requirement to do. It is mandatory for a New Testament Christian. As a matter of fact, they will go to the point of saying, if you're not tithing, then it's a sin, that you're being disobedient, that not tithing. Typically at this point, they'll throw in Malachi chapter 3:10, which is the whole idea of robbing from God. And they'll try to bring in the idea that it's a legalistic, absolute disobedience if a Christian, New Testament Christian, post-resurrection with the power of the Holy Spirit inside of us, that we should be giving, that we have to give, or you'll be sinning 10%. That's one basic main teaching. The second one is this. The Old Testament had it, like we said, which was be absolutely true. It was everything I just said was seen and taught and learned in the Old Testament by the Jewish people in the nation of Israel. The New Testament Christian, however, does not abide by this Jewish law. The New Testament Christian has adopted the principle of a tithe as a standard. So we look back and we can see the Christian church, and we should understand that Paul, James, Peter, no New Testament writer ever tells the Christians post-resurrection, here's what you should do, you have to tithe. It is never said there. As a matter of fact, I was telling some folks this week, I wish Paul would just have come out and said, hey, Church of Corinth, you know the Jewish people, your heritage people, they had to give 10%, and here's what you need to do. By the third month after you become a Christian, you need to be giving 10% of your income or you're sinning. I wish Paul would just have said that. It would have been a lot easier. But we never see that. There's no teaching even talking about tithe. Now, do we believe that the idea, the principle, the standard was carried over into the church? Absolutely. It's a principle, it's a standard, but the tithe is never mentioned. Absolutely, we believe was probably assumed, but what becomes the real giving, what Paul is talking about here, is all of a sudden the Christians see themselves as stewards of everything they have, not just this aspect of I've got all this and I've got to legalistically give God 10% or I'm going to be sinning. Paul in the book of Romans, he reminds them, hey, wherever you live, you need to pay your taxes. The government that you're living in, you need to pay your taxes. And he says, and then as you give to the church, it needs to be a free will offering. Here he's talking about grace giving. I'll go into more specific. But the idea is that it's not a sin, meaning I became a Christian today at church, incredible. And if I'm not giving 10% of my income by next Sunday, I'm sinning, I'm robbing from God. The New Testament, friends, does not teach that. Paul is going to talk about an idea of seeing ourselves as everything we have as coming from God. As a matter of fact, in 130 AD, Irenaeus was a church father, a church leader. So 130 AD, that's only about 40 years after the book of John was written. So not too long after, right, that the book of John was written. So 130 AD, a church father, church leader, Irenaeus, he says this: the Jews were constrained to a regular payment of tithes. Christians who have liberty assign all their possessions to the Lord, bestowing freely not the lesser portions of their property, not a rigid 10%, since they have the hope of a greater thing. So Irenaeus, I believe, is saying exactly what, if you want to know what Team Church believes, we believe what Irenaeus is just saying. We believe what Paul is saying, which is that we see as Christians grace giving, that everything we have has been given to us by God, and we are to be stewards of that. We're to be stewards of that. Christians are to see themselves as stewards who give grace gifts. And I give, what was the question? How much should I give? Gift. How much should I gift? By grace. How much should I give back to the local church is determined based on my prosperity, with the resources that I have. Paul said twice, according to what you have, and we'll see a little bit more specifically, and the purpose that you believe God is asking you to give freely to his church in a sense of a grace gift, that ministries and missions that God has called you to be a part of. People ask all the time, how much do I have to give? And you should know the Bible in the New Testament, The way Team Church believes and teaches is there's not a specific, you have to be giving 10%. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of people who like the fact, because maybe they grew up that way, and basically they've budgeted everything in, and they just say, we give 10%, and then they never pray about, they never seek God's wisdom of should they be giving more? Should they be giving out of their prosperity? For those of us in this present day that we find ourselves here in America, maybe a little bit more established, a little bit more wealthy, have we ever asked ourselves the question, why has God made me wealthy? Why has God allowed me? Now some would answer, God didn't. I was smart, I had the abilities, and I did it. Well, if you're a Christian, you realize you know that God gave you those abilities. He gave you that smartness. He gave you that winsomeness. He allowed things to happen. He's in control, and that's what Irenaeus was saying. That's what Paul was saying. As Christians, we don't have this rigidity of, I got to give 10% or I'm sinning. It's, God has it all. And God may ask for it all. Or he may ask for it, but no pastor, Paul never did, so I never will tell you exactly what you have to be giving as a follower of Christ. But we should ask ourselves, why do we have this wealth? I would tell you that I believe there's a lot of people who, if they prayed through it, that they would probably give over 10%. But sometimes we just like those boxes that we're checking, right? And for the new Christian, or the person who this is totally new to, how much should I give? This is where you begin to pray. You begin to ask the Lord, how much, based on what I have, should I be giving? Paul said to the church at Corinth, increase that you have, the way that God's blessed you, was not just for your standard of living to go up, but for your standard in giving to go up. To whom much is given, much is required. That's a biblical principle. And so we have this idea of how much should I give? At Team Church, we believe the standard principle of this idea of 10% was carried over. You should know this. I've been very candid about, because of 1 Corinthians, talking about the local church, been very candid about the hours that we work as staff members, the things that we do. Every full-time staff member at our church, they tithe. There's a requirement that they tithe off of their salary that the church gives them. Why do we do that? We do that because it's what I'm getting ready to say. It helps us be the leaders, be the team. It helps us to keep God first. It helps us to learn that we're all in this together. And the reality is that for our staff members, our money comes from the local church. So we above all should be giving back at a higher percentage. You should know that majority of our staff members give well over 10% of what their income is back to the ministries of this church, because it shows a life of full devotion, which goes to our next one, which is, well, why should I give? So again, I don't have the words behind me. The first G is grace. The second G is gift. The third G is gratitude. Why should I give? Why should I give? One big, huge thing is, as a Christian who's growing, who wants to mature, the amount that I give shows and reveals my heart. It shows and reveals my heart for ministry, for missions, and what God is doing. You're like, is that true? Remember, I read to you. It'd have been easy if you could see it. But Paul says, we do this to check on the genuineness of their heart. And so one of the reasons why I give, the reason we answer that question, it shows us where we put our trust. Do you really trust in the Lord? Do you give back from what God has given you on a regular basis because you know that you can trust him with your life, that you have a purity of love for God? It also reminds us, as we give on a regular basis, of what's really first. And I would tell you that a lot of people who give, many of our staff members, our standard of living, our way of living is less than it would be if we did not give. That's just true. A lot of times people will say, pastors will teach, why do you give? And then they'll go into this stuff, you want to give because if you give, God's going to give to you. If you give, God's going to make you rich. And everything they say, I'm just telling you, friends, Paul never says, the New Testament never says. Because some of the most horrible, moral, non-Christian people I know are wealthy, rich people. Some of the greatest, loving Christian people I know are really wealthy people. Wealth has nothing to do with how you give. If it did, we're like, well, the people who hate God, they'd be poor. That's not true. The people who hate God, they're rich. The people who love God, there's many of them, they're rich. It really has nothing to do with it. Pastors like to teach, if you give, then you'll get back, and you'll be rich, because what? They want you to give. Paul says you give based on your heart. You give based on missions and ministry and wanting to be a part of what is happening. The church body needs it to function as a body. This message for me is way more difficult to give because I don't have all the stuff behind me, Greek words and circling and all the things that I could actually move a lot faster if I knew you could see it. But maybe God had a winsomeness behind that, because you can't make this up. When people say many times about the ministries of why we give, well, the Lord doesn't need your money. Again, pastors will tell you, Lord doesn't need your money. He just wants your heart. Oh, practically, principally, yes. Theologically, yes. Practically, no. The church needs money. Listen, we have a whatever broke back there. It's not going to be fixed by next week. We can't enjoy this screen and the way that it inspires and helps out in teaching and ministries and showing all the videos of camp. We can't do that unless we pay for a new processor, would be my guess. I don't know how much that costs. Oh, Lord doesn't need your money. Yeah. These lights and air conditioning, we're planting a new church in St. Petersburg as Liberty and A.J. Holt and the others who are going down there with them. They're not just going to walk down there with no money and show up and go, okay, God, I guess you're just going to drop money in our front door. I guess you're just going to get us a place to stay. It doesn't make sense. Why do pastors say that? God doesn't, because again, they don't want you to feel like he wants your heart. This is true. But when we think about just the practicality, everything I just read to you, what Paul said, we're planting churches, we're helping poor people, we're ministering. See, the whole aspect of this church, if you come here, this church functions. Your kids get taught, your kids go to camp, gas goes in the van, crackers get built, air conditioning, pastors get paid to preach and teach and minister. All of that happens, this is why I read all that, through the functionality of the collections that Paul was talking about. It's just a budgeting aspect of ministry. Why should I give? Proverbs 3:9 says, honor the Lord with your wealth and possessions and the first fruits. And so there is this idea of why. I'm going to hit it for a little bit about sowing and reaping. But I don't want to go into the why you give like so many others do, promising wealth, promising health, because it's just not true. There are a lot of people who give a lot of money to the church and they still die of cancer. We don't give to get wealthy. We don't give to have this great life here. That goes against everything Jesus taught. We give because of the grace that God's given to us. We give practically for the ministry, the gospel ministry of the church. And all of this is seen in our gratitude. The next word, we have grace, gift, gratitude, which answers the why should I give. The next question is, when should I give? And I used the word here, generosity. Paul used it a ton as he was writing. The generosity, when should I give? For him, he said about the collections every week. And so what we learned from them is that there's a regular giving. We should give on a regular budgeting type of giving. Why? So the church can have regular budgeting understanding of the missions and the ministry that it can do. Paul told them, I'm coming to get some money for the poor folks in Jerusalem. When I get there, I'm just going to take the money from what you've already generated in your regular budget, because I don't want to, every time we have something, be like, hey, ask for this, ask for that. And so we like to function that way too. Now, I told you, every year at summer camp, we allow those who want to give over and above what you normally would give to help scholarships. So we definitely want to have those kinds of things. But this generosity answers the question, when should I give? On a regular budgeting basis. The word koinonia, again, is used for sharing, which is it's this idea of generosity and collection with the people. Paul said in chapter 16, I'm coming to get the money for the poor, but I'm going to use the budgeting money you already have. We're going to help Macedonia, and we're going to use that church. Matter of fact, Macedonia, he said, they were struggling, but they wanted to keep giving so they could help Titus do what he was. It's just sharing and giving. It's doing life together. And the functionality of the generosity then is shown by, again, what we're able to give, and we do it on a regular basis. Again, the regular basis, the idea of first fruits, it then shows us what's most important to us. And that's why I want to challenge some of us. If you have never given, but you're a Christian, that you would begin to pray that through and know that in a sense of each Christian should be contributing based on their resources, based on what God's given them, based on the prayer, but everybody should be involved in the fellowship, the sharing, the giving, the ministry. So the last one is this, just basic questions. When should I give? First of the week, right? It shows my generosity. Budgeting from my budget shows my generosity and how I live. The last G is gospel. A couple times in what I read, Paul kept saying it's the gospel ministry, the gospel ministry. Where do I give it? That's the question. You give it, this is absolutely taught in the New Testament, to your local church. To your local church. Paul was talking to the church of Corinth, he says you give there. Galatians, you give there. Macedonia, you give there. Jerusalem, you give there. We're all going to share, we're all going to do missions and ministry, but we give to the local church that we're a part of. And that's why he keeps using that word koinonia, fellowship, the sharing of everything we have together. We do this for the gospel ministry here at the church. Again, there is a practicality, right? This thing does not function by the sense of we're just going to pray and God's going to keep the lights on even though we didn't pay the electric bill. We're just going to pray and we're going to have crackers for the little kids. We're going to have soccer balls. We're going to be able to give money to Liberty and AJ for them to go plant a church. When we planted our church in Missoula, when we help our missions partners. All of that happens, it all happens in a practical sense by money. And the people who think that's not true, they don't read the Bible. Because that's everything I just read to you. That's all Paul was saying. Continue to excel in your giving so that the grace of the gospel can go out. Make sure that you're giving so the ministry can happen. We're going to check your heart by what you give. I didn't say that. Paul said that. And so this idea of where I give is here. Now as I conclude, I want to make sure, because I have given messages when we do a whole series on giving, there's an aspect of sowing and reaping. Does the Lord look for those who are willing to give and be a conduit of grace giving to the church? And then through that, the Lord's like, I can trust that person. And so there's an increase there. Absolutely. That's the whole idea of to whom much is given, much is required. To those who are faithful in a little, God gives you to be faithful in much. You got to have much to give much. So there is that idea. But I just stay away from all that prosperity gospel, the TV pastors peddling their books and stuff about when you give, then God's going to make you rich. A lot of times they want you to give, hoping that maybe God will make you rich, but you're absolutely making them rich. The New Testament knows nothing about that. Again, he goes against everything Jesus taught. But there is this aspect when Paul said that everything comes from God and is distributed by God, so that when I begin to show my heart, when I begin to give, it not only shows my heart for the gospel and ministry and my trusting to God. From that, does that then give God the ability to increase what you have so that you can continue to give? Absolutely. Is that a promise? No. I know people who give over 10% all the time. And if you knew who they were, you would not say they're wealthy people. I know people who are very wealthy who give way over 10%. Again, you can't measure wealth based on what God has asked you to give, and you're setting, that's why Paul says, based on what you have, the prosperity that you have. We want to be faithful with what God has given us. And so when we think about this giving aspect, I want to encourage you, just like I did first service, the ministry and missions that we could do would expand with the more infusion of grace giving. Absolutely. I told first service this, some people were shocked, but we absolutely had people leave our church when we went through our Nexus giving campaign. And they told me or told other people, we don't want to always talk about giving. I was like, this church doesn't always talk about giving. We teach it. But absolutely, just like planting new churches and growing new ministries, we prayed through and we're like, we need space for more kids. We need space for co-op. We need space for offices. We need space to grow ministries as our area around here is growing. So we're absolutely over and above, which we always said, over and above what you normally give, that you would pray through. And we never told anybody what they had to give. As a matter of fact, we never told anybody you had to give. But if you want to see your life be set apart for missions and ministries, then we had that growing aspiration. Paul never shrunk back from saying, hey, we're planting a church over here. I need your church to give so we can plant that church. He saw finances and money as a resource for ministry. That's how we see it. And so some people left. They're like, oh, we don't want to talk about money. Okay. The facility you're sitting in, the air conditioner you're enjoying, somebody had to pay for. It's how the whole thing functions. It's just the way it functions, and we're able to be a part of it. And so as we close today, I'm going to ask you to close your eyes, and we're just going to have a moment to think, a moment to pray. Because as we close 1 Corinthians, when Paul closed 1 Corinthians, he had to re-talk about giving in 2 Corinthians. And so as we leave today, I just want you to take a moment and ask yourself, if you've never given, you're not a regular giver, would you just pray and ask the Lord to show you what you should be giving, what he would like for you to give? I can't tell you that. If you're a regular giver, not only would the Lord say thank you, but of course we as church say thank you, but also would you pray through, and maybe the Lord would inspire you to continue growing in your giving as he has prospered you, as you have. So many people, I can tell you people, who their standard of living for the next 2 years is much lower because they're giving sacrificially to Nexus. They sacrificially give also to the church. The Lord honors that. That may not be what God's asking everybody to do. That's why I love what Paul said. It's based on what you're asking and what the Lord is telling.